Good afternoon, everybody, and I just invite people to come in and to take their seats if they're comfortable to do so. You're so welcome to this afternoon's keynote presentation from Professor Liz Pellicano of University College London, where we'll be exploring autistic autonomy, independence, interdependence, and quality of life. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session, and I will return to the stage at that stage to manage the questions. And if you'd like to ask a question at the end of the session, you can approach one of these two microphones, and we will get to as many as we can. We will be finishing promptly at 3:30. Just a reminder that people can do anything that they need to do to get up and move around and to feel comfortable throughout the session. We would ask people to place their mobile phones on silent, and a reminder that we are using the flipause as opposed to the traditional applause. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Liz Pellicano. Thank you.
Right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Adam, for that lovely introduction. And thank you hugely to Autism Europe and to As I Am for bringing me here to this wonderful conference to Dublin. It's amazing to see loads of friends and colleagues and so much fabulous work that's going on. I've learnt so much through the last few days. Autism Europe, I've been coming for quite a long time now, and it's always a really special event. That sense of listening and learning from people from different countries, each grappling with similar challenges, but bringing distinctive experiences and insights to their work. It's a fantastic place to hear a talk and to give one to. And I've been looking forward to giving this talk for a while now, in part because it's a topic that I've been thinking about for a very long time, and in part because I want to share the results of an amazing knowledge exchange project that I had the pleasure of doing over the summer in partnership with Autistica. The contribution that I want to make today will hopefully be clear, and I hope it stimulates debate. Over the last few years or so, I've been investigating ideas concerning autistic flourishing. What makes a good life for autistic people? In what way, if at all, does it differ from non-autistic people? And what do we need to know as educators, as clinicians, as friends, as neighbours, to help more autistic people thrive? In more recent months, as a result of what I've learned from doing this work, I've turned to think about notions of independence, interdependence, and most importantly of all, autonomy. The right to be able to choose important aspects of your life without having others dictate your own direction. And as such, I've now been asking, how much do autistic people need to be allowed to decide for themselves? How much should they be guided by others? Does a good life require us to be able to shape key decisions as we move through the world? And what does all of that mean about what non-autistic people owe autistic people? Is it just a question of enabling autistic people to be left alone more? Or is there something more to it? Of course, I've quickly become aware that these questions have bedeviled ethicists, philosophers, clinicians, and educators for years, with regards to all of us. When it comes to neurotypical people, there is an enormous academic literature out there on these questions of, what is autonomy? Why does it matter? And how do we get it? Some of that literature stretches all the way back to people like the Victorian thinker John Stuart Mill and his book On Liberty, which set out key principles about the freedoms that we all have the right to expect. And obviously, the answers to these really big philosophical questions matter enormously in all kinds of real-world settings and situations too. So the importance of autonomy, for example, helps explain the importance of consent to medical procedures, or the vital role that norms of free speech have in educational settings. But I found that these issues have often been overlooked when it comes to autistic people. It almost seems that people have decided that autonomy doesn't apply to autistic people, or that they don't want to have the debate or discussion at all. And that seems like a real mistake to me. And that's what I want to rectify today. So, to give it all away at the start, this is what I want to say. It's vital that autistic people, just like non-autistic people, should be able to be at least part author of their own life story. Even if, and perhaps especially if, they require lots of support from other people. In other words, autistic autonomy is really important. That's the fundamental claim. And here's how I'm going to try and make it. So first, I'm going to start with reiterating briefly the conventional medical thinking that I think keeps obscuring autistic autonomy from view. And you will have heard this quite a few times during this conference, so you might have been familiar with it by now, but I think repetition is a very good thing. So I'm going to set out what I see, at least, as the failings of the medical paradigm: narrowly normative thinking, presuming that the absence of autistic autonomy is no problem. Next, I'm again going to suggest that an alternative view requires understanding the key elements of autistic autonomy and what supports and what doesn't support it. And in order to do that, I'm going to draw on some wonderful first-hand testimonies my colleagues and I listened to in a recent advocacy and knowledge exchange project. And I'll draw on some existing literature too. In particular, I'll suggest that there are three key elements to a theory of autistic autonomy, and that will be part two. So element one says that we need to ensure that autistic people can act. That is, they should be allowed to do the things that they want to do that non-autistic people might find odd or unusual without fear of reproach, especially when there's no harm to themselves or to other people. Element two is that we need to start seeing the world anew in different ways. That is, autistic autonomy depends on non-autistic people learning to appreciate difference and diversity and responding to it accordingly. And element three concerns the role of caring relationships that can help autistic people lay the foundations for their own autonomy. That last one is particularly important because it belies the myth that autonomy means just being left alone, when it in fact requires conscious support. Okay, so here we go. So part one. Let me begin with the current state of play. As many of you will know, my own view, I've talked about this lots of times, is that the way that we've typically understood autism and being autistic comes primarily from the orthodox medical approach. Medicine, understandably enough, tends to look for what is wrong with people and asks how to fix it, rather than looking for what might actually be going right. That is, it tends to focus on deficits and deviations, not on strengths or possibilities. And it's for that reason that we create interventions and treatments that are designed to, remediate these apparent shortcomings, these deficits and deviations, bringing them into line with what we expect, in line with what we think normality looks like. That is, it only sees the autistic person as a problem in need of being fixed. But worse than that, the conventional medical model also suggests that somehow the problem for autistic people usually resides with facts about the individuals themselves, rather than the world that they're forced to live in. And so the burden of kind of correcting these perceived difficulties, these deficits, deviations, is said to lie with the autistic person too. We thus ask, on this account, how autistic people can change, should change, must change, rather than asking the world how the world around them can change to enable them to lead the lives they deserve and want to lead. This conventional medical thinking has a number of problems. But one of them, I believe, is that it keeps obscuring this issue of autistic autonomy from view. Encouragingly, and as we've heard like so much throughout the conference so far, things are changing for the better. So many of us have begun to change the way that we think about autism and about being autistic, about neurodiversity. So whereas scientists and others previously saw being autistic as an inherent kind of diversion from some established norm, they're beginning to see instead, beginning slowly, instead, to see that they're part of the inevitable diversity of human experience, a difference, an element of variety, which can bring both challenges, but also strengths and advantages. And where sometimes, the challenges are sometimes as frequently consequences of the way that the world is set up as they are the direct result of any personal difference. This change in perspective, this shift, has meant that there is less, and hopefully less and less, research asking what is wrong with autistic people than there is trying to change the way that schools or medical services or workplaces work so that they can better serve people's needs. It also means that after years of focusing on what isn't possible for autistic people, we are finally beginning to focus on what is possible instead. And that is pushing autonomy into view. So let me explain briefly what I mean by this. So a few years back, while I was in Sydney during lockdown, rather intense time, I had the pleasure of thinking about just these issues with an amazing team of autistic and non-autistic researchers about what a good life means for autistic people and to work out what we can all do to help them achieve that. And after exploring a host of different possibilities, we finally settled upon an adapted version of the so-called capabilities approach, derived initially from the work of a philosopher, Martha Nussbaum, and shaped anew to take into account particular circumstances of autistic people. You may have heard about this approach yesterday from Jerome de Winter's excellent talk on sexual well-being, so you're primed for it. One of the advantages of this approach is it allows us to identify key dimensions of a flourishing life for any human being, such as physical health or connections to the natural world or sexual well-being. But it leaves the content of each of those dimensions flexible enough to respond to the particular needs and desires of people themselves. That is, it focuses on the real opportunities that are open to each person to live in ways that are meaningful to them. Now, looking at the issue in this way draws immediate attention to the importance of personal autonomy. In technical terms, autonomy is the idea that all people enjoy the right to be at least part author of their own lives, to make the fundamental choices that shape day-to-day existence. The reason that autonomy matters so much is set out best, I think, by American philosopher Danielle Allen. She explains, there is no single picture of the flourishing life. What is shared, however, is that human beings are creatures who need to chart their own courses in life. Humans thrive on autonomy, the opportunity for self-creation and self-governance. And as Allen and others remind us, this is true of all people, even those who are largely dependent on others to help meet their needs. Taking this back to the conventional thinking that I mentioned earlier, I think we can quickly detect a problem. For whereas Allen or Nussbaum or others are talking about autonomy and why it matters to everyone, the conventional medical approach instead talks about independence. So in many settings, that is, achieving independence is often presumed to be a key part of the journey to adulthood for any person. especially in modern European societies and societies that are influenced by Europe. And people also have a very set idea of what independence involves. When we're growing up, we're told that finishing school, getting a job, moving out of the family home, looking after yourself, becoming financially self-sufficient are all the markers of becoming a fully-fledged, independent adult. But independence and autonomy are not the same thing. Being autonomous is all about getting to make important choices. Being independent is all about standing on your own 2 feet, being self-sufficient, self-reliant. Unsurprisingly, people can feel a lot of pressure to live up to this idea of independence and struggle to do it. And autistic people are no exception. It's for this reason, that parents can be really anxious about their children's futures and often talk about the need to prepare their autistic children for independent living in adulthood. And there are therefore countless interventions and strategies intended to help autistic young people and adults take on more responsibilities and to develop their daily living skills, their social skills, their work skills, to unlock a more independent future. But it is never clear whether this is the most important goal. Research says time and time again that autistic people often fare badly on these life goals, that they're far less likely than non-autistic people to go on to post-secondary education, to hold down a job, to live independently. And it's concluded as a result that autistic people must necessarily have a poor quality of life. And that they're also a burden to society because they're not contributing in the way that society expects them to. They're not productive members of society. But what if the priority given to independence of this kind is mistaken? In fact, what if this ideal of achieving full-blown independence, so living with minimal or even no support from others, is in fact an impossible standard for anyone, autistic or non-autistic? As yet another philosopher, the late Alistair MacIntyre, did so much to remind us. He said, "We all depend on others throughout our lives." In MacIntyre's phrase, human beings are indeed rational animals. We're thinking, we're planning, we're doing those things, but we're also dependent ones. Sometimes we all need overt care, particularly during some parts of our lives. So during infancy, in fact, most of our childhood, older age, and also during times of illness. And throughout our lives, we also need the care of others to help meet our practical and our emotional needs. We also provide that same care to other people. It's for this reason that the American disability thinker Eva Kitte talks about the myth of independence. She writes, "Independency is supposed to involve standing on one's own 2 feet. None of us stand on our own 2 feet. None of us are self-sufficient in this way." The alternative to independence is not, of course, simply dependence. It is also interdependence. It's a term that you might have heard if you went to T.C. Weisman's wonderful talk on Thursday. I first came across this notion, actually I think it was exactly 15 years ago now, when I had the pleasure to organise one of the first conferences on the ethical foundations of autism research at University College London. And we brought together an amazing array of people that day, so scientists, autistic activists, philosophers, clinicians, family members, the broader public. And one of the most powerful talks was by my now wonderful friend and collaborator, Wen Lawson. And Wen said that day, throughout the generations, society has consisted of people needing one another. It's not shameful to need other people in one's lives. Some need support and assistance more than others. Supporting autistic people and their families is just as needed as support for neurotypical people and their families. It might just look a bit different. This notion that we are all mutually dependent on each other, that is, what Wen called at that time, interdependent, should not have been a revelation to me at that time, but it was. Especially because it contrasted so sharply with the view that autistic people, especially those with high support needs, shouldn't be left to guide their way in life, to make their own choices, to set their own aspirations, or that they should somehow be set up for this huge test, either complete independence or nothing at all. Now, given all of this, I think we can understand why, or I hope we can understand, why we might need to let independence drift away. But the same doesn't go for this idea of autonomy. As I've mentioned, autonomy is the hope that each of us can shape our lives according to our own choices, values, and aspirations. And it instinctively makes sense then to think that, I achieve autonomy not by being left on my own, but when I'm able to make choices of my own and pursue them, rather than being forced to do one thing instead of another simply because someone else tells me to. This idea is like independence, insofar as it suggests we should be the driving force of our own lives, but it is different in all of those important ways too. So autonomy is compatible, for example, with being confident in some areas of our lives, like when we're pursuing our most treasured interests, but finding it difficult to be so in other areas, like when choosing what to do in a railway station or a supermarket, or when trying to cross a busy road safely. One reason why this matters so much is that autistic people who are non or minimally speaking, who have an intellectual disability and or who have complex support needs, have sometimes been considered unable to conceptualise or to communicate their precise wishes, and as such are said to be incapable of being in control, even in part, of their own lives. But this is clearly wrong. Everyone has the right to some autonomy in their life, and its absence is always a loss. So, if that's the in-principle case, and the problem with the status quo, I hope, is dealt with, how do we give some concrete substance to this idea of autistic autonomy? What is, or what should be, the specific role of autonomy in autistic people's lives? And how can we hope to achieve more autistic autonomy rather than less? So that's my second part of my talk today. And in the past 6 months, an amazing group of colleagues of mine and I've embarked on a knowledge exchange project with Autistica, the autism research charity in the UK, to find out about precisely these issues. So in this project, we wanted to hear directly from autistic people, and from some of them close to them, about the role that autonomy plays in their everyday lives. To do so, we asked groups of people of different ages, backgrounds, experiences, and from different parts of the country to share their stories. They could do that through their own words or by using other forms of creative expression, such as art and photography. We also did some art and craft workshops with autistic people with intellectual disability. We didn't ask people, what does autonomy mean to you? Because that's too abstract a term. Instead, we wanted their stories to reveal things like, the moments when they felt able to make the choices that matter to them in their own lives, and about the times when things or other people have gotten in the way and stopped that from happening. So in this next part of my talk, I'm going to draw on this wonderful collection of stories, artwork and photography, and other work that we've done to demonstrate the key ways in which autonomy matters to autistic people. And that's the 3 elements of autistic autonomy I briefly mentioned at the start. Okay, element 1. So this first element is that in order to have a chance of being autonomous, autistic people should be allowed to do the things they want to do that non-autistic people might find odd or unusual without being consciously prevented or fear of reproach, especially when they're harmless. There's no harm to themselves or to others. That sounds simple, right? But, and I'm sure you all know, it's not. I'm going to illustrate why it matters with an example on the treatment of stimming behaviours, rhythmic, repetitive behaviours that many autistic people do, like clapping hands, twiddling fingers, flapping. Seen through the lens of that traditional or conventional medical model, these are often described as an individual problem. They apparently serve no clear purpose or function and can prevent a child or adult from learning adaptive, or other skills. But a study that a friend and colleague of mine, Robin Stewart, led back in 2015 suggested that this is not the case. I actually did a workshop with Robin in Liverpool on Wednesday, just before I flew to London, and she reminded me of the reason why she did this study. Robin, so this must have been back in like 2014, she was at a conference in the US, and a psychiatrist was speaking, must have been about repetitive behaviours, and he said the only reason that autistic people kind of do these repetitive behaviours, I don't think he used the word stimming, but do these repetitive behaviours is because they're told not to. Which, of course, Robin, being autistic herself, thought was absolutely absurd, and so she desperately wanted to prove him wrong. And I think she has. So she set out to do this survey. She surveyed 100 autistic adults aged from 16 to 65, who highlighted a range of reasons for stimming, which did not include that, because they were being told not to, including a coping mechanism to reduce anxiety or overstimulation, or a way of calming down. Moreover, the majority of people, 80% of survey respondents, reported that they generally or sometimes enjoyed stimming. That is, they liked doing it. They found joy in those experiences. It's only because those activities are unusual to non-autistic people that they got described as a problem. They usually don't do anyone any harm, but people didn't like them nonetheless. While 80% of people said they enjoyed stimming, almost the same number, 72%, had been told not to do it by other people in authority. So teachers, doctors, mums or dads are the people. And in a follow-up study that Robin and I did, led by Stephen Kapp, our autistic adult participants told us the same thing. And more than that, they talked about the effects of being shut down. So when told not to stim as an adult, one of our participants, Clive, he said he felt belittled, as though he's about 5, being told off for genuine misbehaviour. He said, "It makes me feel that age again. I shouldn't feel like I'm in reception class again, learning basic things." And another participant, Sinead, flashed back to the highs of stimming she used to freely enjoy. She said, "I remember as a child spinning all the time and loving spinning and loving swinging and feeling that movement all the time. But then I also realised that there was a point where it wasn't acceptable to be spinning anymore. So it actually still feels glorious if there's no one around and I can skip or I can spin and it's like I'm breaking the rules." By thinking about this, we learn something really simple, but really important. Often, it's the broader context which creates the problematic response, not the behaviour itself. So it's non-autistic people's reaction to stimming is the issue here, the broader social norms, not the stimming per se. And that takes us to the first major lesson of our discussion. So greater social acceptance is required of the everyday things which give autistic people joy. Harnessing autistic interests in other facets of life, like in schools and work, is important if they're able to feel that they can do the things which matter to them with no harm to themselves or to others. It's not just the direct behaviour of other people that matter, though. It's also the places and spaces that we inhabit that can also limit autistic people's autonomy. One of the contributors to our Autistic Autonomy project, Anna, herself a trained architect, wrote so eloquently about how everyday spaces in cities, in villages, in communities can exclude autistic people and stifle their autonomy. I'm going to read an excerpt from her writing. Anna wrote, "To leave the house, to go to town, risks social interactions that I cannot prepare for. Stress, dissociation, sensory overload, exhaustion. Yet, I want to be there. I want to see life. I want to know the rhythm of my city. I want to see the sticker wars, the nun on her bike, the medieval fireplace, the pest, the juggler, the screaming, the seagulls eating chicken rolls. So I walk the muse lanes, the close, the entries. I weave through the city, avoiding the places I expect unexpected encounters. And then I inhabit those other spaces, the changing room, the toilet stall, the parked car, the seat that faces the river and allows me to turn my back to the city. I go to the Snug, the one in the Tom Collins pub. This is in Limerick City. It allows me to avoid going into the pub altogether. So as I approach the front door, to the left of the main door is another red door, and when I go through, I'm in a cupboard of a room. It has a bench, a lamp, a high window, a radiator, and a screen of glass between me and the rest of the pub. And during the day or on a weeknight, I am sure to have no competition for it. On a busy night, I can squirrel away, basking in the sound of life, but in a space of my own. My kind of sensory seeking, but without the masking or the social interaction. None of the spaces that Anna describes were made for her. But she's found a way to experience her city that works for her. I think we can also appreciate, though, how the everyday places and spaces that we inhabit, so the pubs, cafes, the museums, the streets, the places of worship, schools, workplaces, they can limit autistic people's autonomy. So that's the first key element of autistic autonomy, that autistic people should be able to pursue their interests, passions, and behaviours, just like non-autistic people generally do, without being limited by arbitrary social expectations or norms, and by spaces and places that are exclusionary. And this takes us to our second key element of autistic autonomy. If non-autistic people are going to stop standing in the way of autistic people being able to pursue their wishes, that is, if non-autistic people are going to stop limiting autistic autonomy, then they're going to need to change themselves too. In particular, non-autistic people will need more broadly to recognise that autistic people often see the world in a different way to them, and they need to be, non-judgmental about that, even to empathise with it. And we all know from Damien Milton's double empathy problem and the huge amount of research now that is inspired by that, which we've heard a lot out from this conference already, non-autistic people can find this really difficult. All of us tend to get stuck in our way of looking at things and expect everyone else to do the same. But at the moment, this is really restricted. It causes breakdowns in communication and Again, I think this is beautifully illustrated by some of the stories from our autistic autonomy testimonies. So one person, Helena, who's autistic herself, spoke of the joys of parenting. She told me about her two autistic children. They're both very autistic in how they relate to the world, she said, but they're also both entirely different. Her son, she says, is an absolute genius. I don't know, he just loves working. Her daughter, on the other hand, is the opposite. She's really clever, but she won't be doing like GCSE exams, school exams or anything, because it just all gets in the way. And for Helena, neither is right or wrong. She says qualifications are just one thing, and she'll still find her place in the world. But Helena still worries that not everyone appreciates the importance of these differences or the need to adjust expectations to them. So her daughter's school, she says, don't really appreciate how intelligent she is. She told me this lovely story about when they went on holiday to Spain. And since then, her daughter has done Duolingo every day, and she's on like a 600-day streak. Helena said she's got the accent, everything. She's like a native, and it's just hilarious. It's like she can literally have that, and you can have all this discussion about that. But at school, they don't see anything. For Helena then, accepting and responding to personal differences is absolutely crucial to her understanding of what it is to be autonomous, to set one's own path in life. The same goes for another conversation that I had with a wonderful woman named Shirley, who has two grown-up autistic sons, one in their 40s and one in their 30s, one who she describes as non-speaking, and the other who she says has a bit of language. Shirley was telling me how the world looks different to them in the sense that they get joy and comfort and relaxation in ways that she simply didn't naturally understand, but has come to appreciate. Here's what Shirley had to say. It's not about forcing all your ideas or wishes on them, because they might desire something completely different to what you think is good for them. And seeing the difference that can make is important too. So one of her sons, the one who's non-speaking, she says, he likes lying on the floor because I think that's where he feels most comfortable. It's not that easy for everyone, she admits. She says he's quite a big bloke. He's 6 foot odd. He lies on the floor across between two rooms. And so you have to sort of climb over him. But it is where he is most happy and most at ease. And it's for that reason, Shirley says, that I don't really like to disturb him. I always offer him a cushion for his head, and I think he just takes it out of politeness. And I say, oh, do you want a cushion? And so he just puts it there, and he lies on it, and then he smiles. Thinking through what it all means, Shirley sums it up perfectly. That's just his thing. And I recognise that that's how he feels most comfortable, on a hard floor. It just feels good to him. It obviously makes him feel very grounded, and he probably likes to look at the world from that angle. If you lie down and you just look up, it is quite amazing, actually. You see the world in a different way, don't you? He's just worked that out for himself, and that's how he likes to be. What all of this means is that if we care about promoting autistic autonomy, we need to do more than just not impose our rules or expectations. We need to learn properly to appreciate difference and diversity and to respond to it accordingly. To see the world anew from a different perspective. Okay, so far, we've learnt that autistic autonomy matters, that it's too often criticised or stamped out by authority figures or constrained by environments that aren't built with autistic people in mind. And then not doing all of that requires us to get used to seeing the world in different ways. But what's the last thought? To get there, I think we need to remember something that I said earlier. So the notion of autonomy suggests we should be the driving force in our own lives. It's different from notions of independence because it recognises that being able to make those choices, or even knowing that there are choices to make, often requires the help and support of others, rather than simply being left to do everything by ourselves. It's going back to the relationality between people, that interdependence. That means autistic autonomy doesn't just require allowing someone to do the thing they want to do, or appreciating that they will want to do things differently. Instead, it involves some element of practically making it possible for them to make those choices and to pursue them. Again, I'm going to talk through a few more of the conversations that we had to illustrate this point. The first comes from my conversation with Sally. She's a vibrant 20-something, currently living in temporary accommodation in East London, having moved out of the family home after an issue almost a year ago, after her mum passed away. When we spoke, she described to me how living on your own isn't always easy. Yes, she has more freedom, and she's had a much-needed break from having to go to church, which was a non-negotiable when she was living in the family home, and her Nigerian family's expectations of her. Here she says, I'm of Nigerian background and my family's belief is Christian. And I guess that affects how they see things and what they want for my life too, like marriage and kids, for example. But she's paying an exorbitant amount on rent to East London, which meant she's had to cut back on doing the things that she really enjoys, like baking, travelling abroad, buying clothes, because the rent is just so high. She's also stuck with nosy people where she lives in the block of flats, and even scary people too. So much so that she sometimes doesn't want to leave her flat in case she sees them, which is a shame because Sally clearly values that connection with others very much. And the desire to be with other people also extends to a hope for personal relationships too. Sally said, I haven't had a relationship before. I guess at least to experience it once would be nice. She describes joining an online dating app, but being warned off it by the charity that's currently supporting her. She said, some people say that I'm vulnerable. And, sometimes I think I'm vulnerable too. But their view is that I should meet people in the church or the library, which is a very backdated view. Sally clearly has a lot going on in her life. She's keen to build her relationship with her family and to keep trying to find a partner. And then, of course, there's the housing situation, whether to stay on her own, spending so much of her money on rent, but having that, freedom, at least some of it, or to move back in with the family, which had its restrictions. It's a tough one, Sally says, as there's so much to consider. Talking to Sally made me reflect that if someone was really trying to help facilitate her autonomy, they would be doing something, or at least helping to do something about the housing situation, and they'd also be there doing what they can to help her make her own judgments about the important relationships in her life, or even the new relationships in her life. But unfortunately, she doesn't have that. She doesn't have anyone to help support her make those decisions, at least effectively. And in my final example, I want to go back to Shirley, the mother of the 2 grown-up autistic sons. During our conversation, Shirley told me in detail about an agonisingly difficult series of choices that she's had to face about her 2 sons' access to food. they both find it very difficult from time to time either to stop eating significant amounts of food that are seriously unhealthy, or to drinking liquids that can sometimes be dangerous. And Shirley told me that, she's gone through different periods of either locking things away or choosing not to. But when she doesn't use the locks, both sons can really struggle with the control that they themselves want to exercise. Shirley said, "I used to feel terribly guilty about the cupboard being locked. And then I think I decided not to lock it. And then my eldest son, one day, he just said to me to put the chocolates in the cupboard, and he said, 'Lock the cupboard.'" Shirley she's deeply troubled by this situation, but makes sense of it herself too. She said, I guess you could say the same thing about smoking or alcohol. Some people need these things emotionally or whatever, and they can't stop. So they probably wouldn't want any alcohol in the house if they're trying to look after their health. So I sort of equate it to a similar thing, and we just have to help them with that. Sally's and Shirley's stories highlight the role of caring relationships in helping autistic people lay the foundations for their own autonomy. They show that autonomy always depends on an incredibly complex set of social factors. No one can be autonomous without living in autonomy-generating relationships. Although in Shirley's example, it can be restrictive in nature, it is motivated by an autonomy-enhancing purpose. So it is about being supported to kind of build interests, to develop skills, to make choices, to shape a life, to write a story for yourself. Shirley summed it up. She said, as a non-autistic carer in this situation, what you're doing is listening and steering their lives in a way that keeps them safe, to enable them to enjoy their lives, to have the best possible quality of life, but also to allow them to make their own choices. The question then becomes, how can we support other people, so that might be parents, teachers, carers, support workers, to promote autistic people's autonomy rather than limit it? Okay, we've covered quite a lot of complex philosophical ground in today's talk, so thank you so much for bearing with me. Let me conclude by going back to what I've described as the 3 elements for promoting autistic people's autonomy. Our goal is to emphasise the need for autistic people to have the same range of choices and opportunities in their life as everybody else. Not to have limits on what they're allowed to hope for or what they should aspire, but to be able to set their own courses in life, to make their own way according to their own distinctive ideals and dreams for the future. Doing that involves 3 things. 1, involves stopping being prejudicial about behaviours in which are fun or soothing and hurt no one, but might seem outside the norm. 2, starting to try to see the world in a different way, or at least empathise with those who do. And 3, acknowledging that all of us have a responsibility to help people lay the foundations for their own choices whenever we can. If we investigate these a little more carefully, we see that they're on a sliding scale between what philosophers call negative rights and positive rights. The first one there is purely negative. Stopping people doing the harmless things that they want to do. The second is a bit more positive. Start trying to understand people. The third is fully positive. Start giving people the foundations they need to be autonomous. My own view, as I've set out today, is that we need to do all of those. The challenge now is to work out exactly where the priorities lie and how we should get started. Addressing those issues won't be easy. The first and second require important cultural change, as you all know. You know, getting people to move from autism awareness to autism acceptance. And that, we know, is resisted, sometimes openly and sometimes just implicitly. The third will require more still. It needs serious resourcing. Autistic people will need the educational, medical, social and economic opportunities that they have often been denied, provided for them more openly and more generously by governments, businesses and the broader community. And it will also require some grappling with some really complex ethical issues. It's not always straightforward to know, for example, when autonomy-enhancing interventions become autonomy eroding. Any of you who have thought about the sorts of issues described in the stories I've shared above will be aware of that. But we will need to work together through these complexities. Autistic people and non-autistic people alike, experts by research and experts by experience. And I'm convinced that we shouldn't let any of those kind of difficulties put us off. We need to make the first move to take autistic autonomy seriously, to take autistic flourishing seriously. After all, I think we'll be in an infinitely better position than we are now if one of the first questions that clinicians, educators, social workers, employers, friends, neighbours ask whenever they're faced with a complex issue is, will this restrict autistic people's autonomy or will it enhance it? It might not be the only thing we need to know, but it is most definitely an important one. Thank you very much. Just to say an enormous thanks to so many people who've had so many amazing conversations over the years, but particularly this group of people who've really supported the project that we've done on autistic autonomy. All of the stories that I've read through and described, you can click on the QR code and read them all and see them all. It was not a research project. We are not analysing data. People shared their stories and they're meant to inspire conversation and debate. So I very much hope you enjoy them and I'm very grateful. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that really fascinating presentation that I know we'll all have taken a huge amount from. If anyone would like to ask a question, we have a small number of minutes to do that, so people can approach the microphone on either the left or the right. And I think we have our first question here, so I'll go to this lady here.
Thank you so much. Brilliantly done. I have recently come across some literature that reports that when people endure trauma, the best solution to regain engagement with their bodies is through rhythmic behavior. Yet we have a whole population of people who, without an early infancy-based diagnosis, from infancy to at least preschool, are inadvertently re-traumatized, and then when they start rocking and stimming, which is a primal, appropriate response to coping with the trauma they're enduring, whether it's sensory trauma or just trying to survive in this very confusing world, we say, stop moving. And you can't learn if you stop moving. And I believe autonomy begins there. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think we should stop stopping people. That's what I think. And stop traumatizing them and re-traumatizing. I think they wouldn't have those traumatizing kind of experiences if we did actually start to appreciate, how they think about the world and responding to those kind of personal differences. And that we kind of allow them to do the things that don't, that aren't harming anybody else. I mean, I think, but that are, important to people, whether they are just joyful or whether they actually serve that kind of soothing, kind of protective function. No, I think that's enormously, important thing now.
Hello, Liz. Thank you for that presentation. It was very thought-provoking, really clear and helpful. I've been working with young autistic learners in schools for autistic children for the last 15 years, and I think one of the things you talked about, which resonated with me, is sometimes the difficulty of that calculus of when something is autonomy supporting. I think about very young children who maybe wear nappies and are very attached to those nappies and are very confident being independent or autonomous within, while wearing nappies, and find it very distressing to learn maybe to move away from that to what is perceived to be a goal for independence. I'm just wondering what you think about how professionals can, or how people who want to support autonomy can make those judgments effectively and respectfully and support autonomy in that way.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, and it's the kind of conversations I don't think we have enough, because these happen all the time, every day. It's like an everyday thing. It's not necessarily about these big kind of notions around, are they going to live by themselves or not? They're kind of on a small scale, but really important scale. And I don't think I have an answer for you. But it's hard because it is, it's such a fine line from from pushing people out of their comfort zone and allowing them to have those opportunities to open up the possibilities, but also not, because it might just all be a bit scary. So it is about, people are making these sorts of ethical judgments all the time. And so I don't know how we effectively do that, but I think we should start learning, talking to people, but also learning to try and work out how we can do that more effectively.
Hi, thank you for your information and your talk today. I found it very informative. My question is more around the people component of when we say autistic people. I recognize, your framework here, but I'm concerned about the role of intersectionality and where that fits in. How do you account for the wide amalgamation of different factors and contexts and life experiences and identities that autistic people might have that are also limited in terms of autonomy, whether by institutions or educational settings?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we heard that in lots of our stories, actually, because lots of people had different intersecting identities. And how, if you think about Sally's story, her Nigerian kind of background, she felt was limiting her autonomy, because all of these expectations about having to get married and having to have kids, and also having to go to church, which she didn't want to do. And so, that's not about being autistic, that's about being Nigerian. And so there are those, and there's a multitude of factors which will definitely intersect, and we don't know about those either. And so I totally agree that we need to try and understand how all of those factors kind of connect, and what we can do to help support that.
Thank you.
This will be our last question next from Neve.
Hi, I just wanted to start by saying I really enjoyed this session. I think that it was a very empowering session to have watched, and it's really sort of hit home with me, considering that I am an autistic adult myself, and some of the things that you've covered in the session is sort of the things that I'm currently challenging with myself, because one thing that I think has been a struggle is that we're currently in the middle of a housing crisis in Ireland, and so for a lot of autistic people, we want to be able to achieve independent living, but we are not able to do so given the lack of affordable housing and lack of housing that would be designed for autistic people. So I suppose it links up to my question, being that if there was any advice you would give to anybody who was looking at selling properties or renting out properties to an autistic person to enable some sort of policy to encourage independent living for an autistic person, what would that be?
I don't know, Neve. I don't know what I'd say to them, but I would say, can I say what I would say otherwise, is that you've really nailed a really important point there, because I've talked a lot about this notion of interdependence and other people. But of course, people's autonomy is also impacted by the broader social and cultural kind of context that we live in, including housing crisis. Mm-hmm. And money matters, and not having it also matters. Mm. And so that is also restrictive in nature, and will affect what people can do and what people can't do, even if they want to do those things. And so it is thinking about that, it's not just the institution, but those kind of broader contexts in trying to kind of respond to anybody's autonomy, but autistic people in particular. But I don't know what you'd say to kind of housing agents. I'm really I don't know.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.